Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Click the like button, and let's begin the story. Mateo was only 11 years old when his world collapsed like the cracked walls of the San Vicente orphanage, where he had been living for 3 years under conditions that would make any adult with a heart weep. The place, located on the outskirts of Guadalajara, housed more than 200 children in a building designed for half that number. Overcrowding was only the first of many problems faced by children abandoned by life. Mateo's story had begun in the cruelest way possible. His parents, agricultural workers who had moved from a small town in Michoacan in search of better opportunities, died in a car accident when he was 8 years old. With no known family and no documents proving his full identity, the boy was transferred to the nearest orphanage, where a nightmare that would last 3 long years began. The director of the orphanage, Don Ramiro Vesquez, was a stocky man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and small eyes that constantly seemed to calculate how much money he could extract from every situation. Officially, the orphanage received generous government subsidies for the care of the minors, but in reality, those funds rarely improved the children's living conditions. Mateo quickly learned the unwritten rules of the place. The children slept in triple-level bunk beds, crammed into damp rooms where mold grew freely in the corners. Meals consisted mainly of watery beans, hard tortillas, and if they were lucky, a piece of chicken on Sundays. But the worst part was not the scarce food or the unsanitary conditions. The worst part was the special jobs Don Ramiro assigned to the older children. These special jobs included cleaning the homes of the director's friends, working on small construction sites with no protection at all, and selling candy on the streets for endless hours under the scorching Jalisco sun. The money they earned, of course, never reached the children's pockets. Don Ramiro claimed it was to cover their living expenses, but everyone knew it was a lie. Mateo had tried to complain several times. First, to the social worker who visited the orphanage once a month, Dona Carmen Ruiz, an older woman who seemed more interested in filling out her forms than actually listening to the children. When Mateo approached her during one of her routine visits, trying to explain the conditions they lived in, she barely looked up from her papers. "Child, you all exaggerate," she had said in a tired voice. "Don Ramiro is a respectable man who has dedicated his life to helping orphans like you. You should be grateful instead of making up stories." The second time he tried to seek help was with Father Miguel, the priest who came to give Mass on Sundays. The clergyman, a thin man in his 60s, initially seemed more receptive. He listened to Mateo for several minutes after Mass, while the other children played in the orphanage's central courtyard. "My son," Father Miguel had said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I understand that life here is difficult, but we must have faith that God has a plan for all of us. Don Ramiro has told me that some children have been spreading false rumors, and I believe it's important that you don't allow yourself to be influenced by those stories." Mateo had realized that Father Miguel and Don Ramiro were close friends, and that any complaint would inevitably reach the director's ears. That same night, Don Ramiro summoned him to his office. "I heard you've been talking nonsense with Father Miguel," he said, sitting behind his dark wooden desk, the light of a yellowish lamp casting threatening shadows across his face. "I think you need to learn to be more grateful for everything I do for you." The punishment had been an entire week without dinner, cleaning the bathrooms from 5 in the morning until 10 at night. But more than the hunger or exhaustion, what hurt the most was the certainty that he was completely alone, with no adult willing to listen to him or protect him. The situation became desperate when Don Ramiro began talking about new opportunities for the older children. Mateo had overheard whispered conversations between the director and some men who visited the orphanage at night. Men who looked at the children in a way that made his skin crawl. There are very generous families willing to give work and a home to responsible children, Don Ramiro announced one night during dinner. Of course, these will be jobs that require full dedication, but in exchange you will have food and a place to sleep. Mateo knew those generous families were not what they seemed. He had seen how some of the older children disappeared during the night, taken away by those strange men, and were never heard from again. The other children whispered about clandestine factories, dangerous work in mines, or things even worse that they did not dare mention out loud. The final straw came one October night when Don Ramiro approached Mateo after dinner. The boy was sitting on his bunk, trying to do his school homework with a pencil that barely had a point and a notebook full of wrinkled pages. "Mateo, I need to talk to you," the director said with a smile that never reaches eyes. "Tomorrow, some very important people are coming to meet you. They've heard that you're a hard-working and responsible boy, and they're interested in offering you a unique opportunity." Mateo's heart began to race. He knew that smile. He had seen Don Ramiro use it before sending other children to unknown destinations. "I don't want to go anywhere," he replied in a trembling voice. "I'm fine here." Don Ramiro's smile vanished immediately. "This is not a request, boy. It's an order. Tomorrow you're leaving, and you'd better behave when they come to pick you up." That night, Mateo could not sleep. He knew that if he waited until the next day, it would be too late. During the 3 years he had spent in the orphanage, he had learned that adults were not always right, that authorities did not always protect children, and that sometimes the only option was to protect oneself. As he lay on his bunk listening to the snores and muffled breathing of the other children, Mateo made the most difficult decision of his short life. He had to escape no matter the consequences. He had to run away that very night, before those important people Don Ramiro had mentioned arrived. At 3 in the morning, when he was sure everyone was asleep, Mateo silently got out of bed. His belongings fit into a small torn backpack, 2 changes of underwear, an extra t-shirt, the athletic shoes that had belonged to another boy who had left months earlier, a blurry photo of his parents that he had managed to keep all those years, and the 30 pesos he had saved selling candy for Don Ramiro. He knew the orphanage like the back of his hand, including the bathroom window on the 2nd floor that hadn't closed properly for months. With his heart pounding so loudly he feared waking the entire building, he slipped through the window and climbed down the drain pipe to the back courtyard. The night was cold and dark, barely illuminated by a waning moon peeking through the clouds. Mateo knew he had only a few hours before they noticed his absence during the morning head count. He had to get as far away from the orphanage as possible before dawn. With his legs trembling from both cold and fear, he began walking toward the mountains that rose behind the orphanage. He had no specific plan, only the certainty that any destination would be better than returning to the hands of Don Ramiro and his mysterious nighttime visitors. Mateo's first hours of freedom were a terrifying mix of relief and panic. As he walked along dusty paths he could barely make out in the darkness, every sound made him jump. The hoot of an owl, the crunch of dry branches beneath his feet, the distant barking of stray dogs patrolling the outskirts in search of food. When the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the horizon, Mateo found himself in an area he did not recognize. He had been walking for more than 4 hours along winding paths that gradually climbed toward the mountains, and now he realized he was farther from the orphanage than he had ever been in his life. In the distance, he could see the city of Guadalajara stretching like a gray stain beneath the morning mist. Hunger began to manifest as a dull ache in his stomach, reminding him that he had fled without breakfast, and that his last meal had been the watery beans from the previous night's dinner. His 30 pesos would not last long, and he had no idea where to find work or help in the middle of nowhere. Around noon, exhausted and with feet full of blisters, he stopped under the shade of a mesquite tree to rest. That was when he heard the roar of engines approaching along the road he had been following. His blood ran cold when he recognized the orphanage's white pickup truck, the same one Don Ramiro used to transport children to their special jobs. Without thinking twice, he threw himself behind some large rocks, holding his breath as the vehicle passed slowly. Through the windows, he could see Don Ramiro in the passenger seat, his small eyes carefully scanning both sides of the road. In the back seat were 2 of the orphanage caretakers, rough men who had never shown a shred of compassion toward the children. "Mateo," Don Ramiro shouted from the open window. "I know you're around here. Don't be foolish, boy. Come back now, and nothing bad will happen to you." Mateo squeezed his eyes shut, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. He knew it was a lie. If he returned, the punishment would be terrible, and they would probably send him immediately with those important people, without giving him another chance to escape. The pickup truck continued slowly along the road, stopping every so often so the men could get out and check bushes and rock formations where a child might hide. Mateo remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, until the sound of the engine completely faded into the distance. When he finally dared to emerge from his hiding place, the sun was already high and the heat was becoming oppressive. He knew he could not continue along the main road. It was too risky. He would have to venture into the wilderness, where it would be harder for them to find him, but also where the chances of getting lost or encountering unknown dangers increased considerably. During the following hours, Mateo moved into increasingly rough and wild terrain. Thorny plants scratched his legs, and more than once he encountered snakes that quickly slithered between the rocks when they heard his footsteps. Water became his most urgent concern. His lips were dry and cracked, and he was beginning to feel the symptoms of dehydration. It was in the mid-afternoon when the encounter that would change the entire course of his escape occurred. As he descended a rocky slope, trying to find any sign of water, Mateo heard male voices approaching. His first instinct was to hide, but when he paid attention to the conversation, he realized they were not the men from the orphanage. "I'm telling you, we saw the footprints around here," said a rough voice. "A barefoot kid walking north. Don Ramiro pays well for information, and 500 pesos for bringing the brat back. That's not bad at all." Mateo felt his stomach sink. Don Ramiro had put a price on his head, and now any adult in the region could be looking for him to collect the reward. He no longer only had to avoid the orphanage employees. Now he had to distrust anyone who crossed his path. As the voices faded away, Mateo continued climbing over terrain that grew increasingly steep and rocky. His athletic shoes, already worn out before his escape, were beginning to fall apart at the soles, and he could feel every stone and thorn through the holes that had opened in the material. At dusk, when his strength was leaving him and he began to consider that maybe it would be better to return to the orphanage before dying of thirst, he saw something that made him stop abruptly. Among a group of particularly large rock formations, there was what appeared to be a dark opening, like the entrance to a cave or tunnel. At first, he hesitated to approach it. He had heard terrible stories about the caves in the region, wild animals, drug traffickers who used them as hideouts, or simply underground labyrinths where it was easy to get lost forever. But the temperature had begun to drop with the setting sun, and he knew that spending the night outdoors in the mountains could be fatal. With cautious steps, he approached the opening. The entrance was larger than it had seemed from a distance, wide enough for an adult to pass through while crouching. The air flowing from inside was cool and damp, a promising sign that there might be water somewhere within. Before entering, he gathered some dry branches and used his last 2 matches, which he had taken from the orphanage kitchen, to create an improvised torch. The flickering light illuminated the rock walls, revealing that the tunnel extended into the mountain on a gentle downward slope. The first few meters were the most terrifying of his life. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every echo of his own footsteps made him think something else was moving in the darkness. But as he advanced, he began to notice something strange. The tunnel did not seem natural. The walls were too smooth, too uniform, as if they had been deliberately carved by human hands. After walking for about 20 minutes through the winding tunnel, he reached a wider chamber, where the improvised torch illuminated something that left him completely breathless. He was not in a natural cave. He was in what had clearly once been an old mine, probably abandoned decades earlier. Scattered across the ground were rusted mining tools, pickaxes, shovels, overturned wheelbarrows, and metal buckets. In one corner, he could make out what appeared to be the remains of an improvised office, a partially rotted wooden table, fallen chairs, and wooden crates that had once held supplies. But the most surprising thing was that the place was not completely empty or abandoned as he had expected. Someone had been there recently. There were remnants of campfires in a cleared area, blankets neatly folded in a corner, and several cans of preserved food stacked beside large water containers that looked relatively new. Mateo cautiously approached the supplies, expecting that at any moment the owner of that improvised refuge would appear. But after waiting several minutes in total silence, he dared to inspect them more closely. The food cans had recent expiration dates. The water in the containers was clear and fresh, and the blankets, though used, were clean and dry. In a small box, he found something that eased his fear a little, a handwritten note in trembling handwriting that read, "To whoever finds this, I am too old to keep coming to the mine. Take what you need, but leave it as you found it. May God bless you. Eusebio." For the first time since his escape, Mateo felt that he could breathe calmly. He had found a refuge where he could spend the night safe from a cold, with access to water and food, and apparently blessed by someone who understood what it meant to need a safe place to hide. That night, wrapped in one of Eusebio's blankets, and with his stomach full for the first time in days, thanks to a can of beans he had carefully opened, Mateo slept more deeply than he had in years. He was unaware that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined possible. Mateo woke up with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the tunnel entrance, feeling more rested than he had in a long time. The old mine had turned out to be the perfect refuge. It was hidden, comfortable, and apparently unknown to anyone else. For the first time since his escape, he allowed himself to think that maybe he had a real chance of surviving on his own. During the following days, he established a careful routine. He woke up early to explore the surroundings of the mine, always staying alert in case a search patrol from the orphanage appeared. He had discovered a small stream about a 15-minute walk away where he could wash his clothes and bathe, as well as several wild fruit trees that provided nutritious supplements to the canned food he had found in the mine. The old mine was much more extensive than he had initially thought. After overcoming his fear of getting lost in the tunnels, he began to systematically explore the different galleries branching off from the main chamber. Some ended abruptly in rocky walls. Others narrowed so much that it was impossible to continue, but a few extended into depths that his improvised torch could not fully illuminate. During these explorations, Mateo began to find strange objects that did not seem to belong to normal mining operations. In a side gallery, he discovered a sealed metal box containing documents wrapped in plastic, detailed maps of the region, and black and white photographs showing men in uniforms working in the mine. The dates on the photographs indicated they had been taken in the 1940s. The documents were written in Spanish, but they contained many technical words that Mateo did not fully understand. However, he was able to decipher enough to realize that the mine had not been excavated merely to extract common minerals like iron or coal. The papers repeatedly mentioned something called strategic mineral and national reserves, terms that sounded far more important than an ordinary mining operation. In another gallery, he found something even more intriguing, a heavy metal door, partially rusted but still solid, blocking access to what appeared to be a deeper section of the mine. The door had a large, old lock that had rusted to the point of being useless, yet still kept the door closed. Mateo tried to force it open with the tools he had found, but the metal was too thick, and he was too small to make much progress. However, what truly captured his attention were the markings on the door, engraved into the metal, barely visible beneath decades of rust. There were symbols that looked like numbers and letters, resembling a combination or code. But even more intriguing were the marks that appeared to have been made recently, scratches on the rusted surface, as if someone else had been trying to open the door not long ago. While examining the door more closely, Mateo found something that made him step back in surprise. On the ground, partially buried beneath decades of dust and debris, there was an object that definitely did not belong to the era of the mine. A modern cell phone, clearly damaged and without a battery. The discovery of the phone confirmed that someone else had been in the mine recently, someone who, like him, had reached that mysterious door and tried to open it. But who? And why had they abandoned a cell phone there? Over the following days, Mateo's curiosity about what lay behind the door became an obsession. He spent hours trying to decipher the symbols engraved in the metal, experimenting with different number combinations he found in the documents from the metal box. He knew it was probably a waste of time, but it was the only activity that distracted him from the loneliness and the constant fear of being discovered. One afternoon, while working on the door with an old pickaxe he had found, he heard something that made him freeze instantly. Human voices approaching the entrance of the mine. His heart began to pound so loudly that he feared the sound would give him away. He quickly gathered his tools and hid in one of the side galleries from where he could hear without being seen. "I'm telling you the tracks lead in here," said a voice he did not recognize. "They're fresh, no more than a few days old." "Are you sure it's the kid Don Ramiro is looking for?" asked another voice. "Because if we waste time chasing ghosts, he won't pay us a single cent." Mateo felt his blood turn to ice. The men hunting for the reward had found the mine. He curled deeper into the shadows of the gallery, trying to make himself invisible as the voices drew closer. "There are clear signs that someone has been living here," continued the first voice, now much closer. "Look, fire remnants, open cans. The brat is around here." Somewhere nearby, Mateo heard footsteps advancing through the main tunnel, accompanied by the beams of powerful flashlights that cast dancing shadows on the rock walls. He realized he had minutes, maybe seconds, before being discovered. With his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, he made the riskiest decision of his life. Instead of staying hidden and waiting to be found, he decided to do the unthinkable. Head straight toward the mysterious door he had been trying to open. If he was going to be captured, at least he would try to discover what secrets the mine held before being returned to the orphanage. Moving as silently as possible through galleries he already knew by heart, he reached the metal door just as the voices of the bounty hunters grew louder in the main chamber. Desperate, he began entering number combinations into the rusted lock using the sequences he had memorized from the documents he had found. To his absolute surprise, after several attempts, he heard a soft metallic click. The lock, weakened by decades of rust, finally gave way. With trembling hands, Mateo pushed the heavy door, which opened with a slow, prolonged creak that he hoped had not been heard by the men searching for him. Behind the door was another gallery, but this one was different from all the others he had explored before. The walls were smoother, clearly excavated with greater care, and the air coming from inside was dry and carried a strange smell, metallic but sweet. Without time for doubts, Mateo slipped through the opening and closed the door behind him as quietly as possible, hoping the bounty hunters would not notice that it had been opened. In the total darkness of the new tunnel, he began to move forward by touch, using the walls as a guide, unaware that he was about to discover secrets that would change not only his own life, but possibly the fate of many other people. Behind him, he could hear the voices of the men searching the galleries one by one, drawing dangerously close to his location. But ahead, in the deep darkness of the secret tunnel, something extraordinary awaited discovery by an orphaned boy who had fled in search of nothing more than a safe place to hide. The secret gallery, behind the metal door, turned out to be completely different from the tunnels of the old mine. As Mateo moved cautiously through the darkness, feeling the walls to orient himself, he realized that this was not a common mining excavation. The walls were too smooth, too uniform, and the ground had been carefully leveled, as if this section had been built with a specific and secret purpose. After walking for what felt like an eternity, carefully feeling each step to avoid falling into some hidden pit, Mateo saw a faint light filtering in from somewhere ahead. As he drew closer, he discovered that the light came from a natural opening in the ceiling of the gallery, high enough to be out of his reach, but allowing daylight to partially illuminate an underground chamber that left him completely breathless. The chamber was enormous, much larger than the main hall of the old mine, and it was filled with objects that clearly did not belong to a mining operation from the 1940s. There were wooden crates marked with military symbols, sealed metal containers with labels in several languages, and equipment that looked far too modern for the period in which the mine had supposedly been operating. But what truly caught his attention were the stacks of golden metal bars carefully piled in one corner of the chamber. Mateo had seen gold in movies and television programs, but he had never been so close to the real precious metal. The bars glowed with a soft sheen under the light filtering down from above, and each one bore engraved markings that looked like official seals. With trembling hands, he approached to examine the bars more closely. They were heavy, much heavier than he had imagined, and were clearly marked with symbols that appeared to belong to different countries and organizations. Some had eagles engraved on them, others bore symbols he did not recognize, and several had dates indicating they had been produced in the 1940s and 50s. As he examined the gold, Mateo gradually began to understand what he had discovered. This was not an ordinary mine. It was a hiding place, a place where someone had deliberately concealed a fortune in gold and other valuable objects. But who had done this? And why had such enormous wealth been abandoned in a lost cave in the mountains of Jalisco? In another section of a chamber, he found documents that began to give him clues about the mystery. They were stored inside a hermetically sealed metal box that had withstood decades of humidity and decay. The papers were written in German, Spanish, and English, with dates confirming that everything had been hidden there in the late 1940s. The documents mentioned names he had heard in history classes, Nazi officers, international organizations, and references to asset extraction and relocation operations. Although he did not fully understand all the technical terms, Mateo was able to decipher enough to realize that he was looking at evidence of an operation to move stolen treasures from Europe to Mexico after the end of the Second World War. There were detailed maps showing routes from Mexican ports to this specific location, inventory lists cataloging works of art, jewelry, and gold bars, and correspondence between individuals who had clearly been involved in large-scale criminal activities. One of the documents, written in Spanish with elegant but urgent handwriting, particularly caught his attention. The operation must be completed before the end of the year. The Mexican authorities have been informed that this is a legitimate investment in mining development. The gold must remain hidden until it is safe to transport it to Argentina. Mateo began to realize that he had stumbled upon something far greater than a simple abandoned mine. He had found what appeared to be a wartime treasure cache, possibly gold stolen by the Nazis and later transported to Mexico by war criminals who had fled Europe after Germany's defeat. But his astonishment quickly turned into terror when he heard the sound of the metal door being opened again. The voices of the bounty hunters now echoed clearly through the secret gallery, and he realized they had discovered his escape route. "Over here," one of the voices shouted. "The door's open. The kid has to be in here." Mateo realized he was trapped. The underground chamber had no other visible exit, and the men searching for him were approaching fast. But as he desperately looked for somewhere to hide, he noticed something he had overlooked during his first exploration. A small opening, partially hidden behind the stacks of gold, that seemed to lead to another tunnel. With no time to consider the risks, he slipped through the opening just as the first flashlight beams began to illuminate the main chamber. The new tunnel was narrow and low, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees, but at least it was taking him away from his pursuers. As he crawled through the tight passage, he could hear the men's exclamations of astonishment as they discovered the treasure chamber. "My God," one of them shouted. "Look at all this gold. We're rich." "Forget the kid for now," the other replied. "We have to take all of this before someone else finds it. This is worth millions." Mateo realized that, at least temporarily, the bounty hunters had forgotten about him. They were too busy staring at the fortune they had discovered to continue chasing an orphaned boy for the small reward Don Ramiro had offered. The tunnel he was crawling through eventually widened enough to allow him to stand up, and after several minutes of moving through the darkness, he saw another source of natural light ahead. This time, the light came from a full exit, an opening that led outside the mountain, probably excavated as an emergency escape route by whoever had created the original hiding place. When he emerged from the tunnel, he found himself on a completely different side of the mountain, much farther from the orphanage and from the main roads the search patrols had been using. The sun was beginning to set, and from his new position he could see distant lights from towns he did not recognize. But as he took in the view, trying to orient himself and decide what to do next, he realized that his situation had changed drastically. He was no longer just an orphaned boy running away from an orphanage. Now he was the sole witness to an extraordinary discovery, a treasure probably worth millions of pesos that had been hidden for decades. More importantly, he realized that the men who had found the gold were not going to report their discovery to the authorities. They had talked about taking it all, which meant they were planning to steal the treasure for themselves. And if one day he tried to tell anyone about what he had seen, those men would have every reason to make sure he could not speak. For the first time since his escape, Mateo faced a reality that he might have discovered something too valuable and too dangerous to handle alone. He needed help, but who could he turn to? He could not trust the local authorities, who might be connected to Don Ramiro or to the men who had found the gold. He had no family or friends he could rely on. As night fell over the mountains, Mateo made a decision that would change the course of events. He was not going to run any farther. He was going to find a way to legitimately claim what he had discovered, not only for his own benefit, but to make sure the treasure did not fall into the hands of criminals who had threatened and hunted him. But first he needed a plan, and more than anything else, he needed to find trustworthy adults who could help him navigate a world of laws, authorities, and dangers that a child of barely 11 years old could not face alone. His adventure was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The first days after the discovery of the treasure were the most difficult of Mateo's life. He found a smaller, less accessible cave where he could spend the nights, but the knowledge of what he had discovered haunted him constantly. He knew the bounty hunters were working to remove the gold from the mine, probably at night to avoid detection, but he had no idea how to stop them or whom to turn to. His first priority was to find adults who could help him, but after 3 years in the orphanage, he had learned to deeply distrust authority figures. Still, he knew he could not face this situation alone. He needed to find people who were both honest and powerful enough to confront what was clearly an organized criminal operation. His first attempt was to approach the nearest town, Santa Maria de los Remedios, a small settlement about a 2-hour walk from his new location. He arrived early in the morning, when the streets were filled with people heading to work, hoping to blend into the crowd. The town was typical of a region: adobe houses with red-tiled roofs, a central plaza with a colonial church, and several small shops that served the local population. Mateo observed carefully for several hours, trying to identify who might be trustworthy and who might be connected to the corruption networks he already suspected existed. His first choice was the local elementary school teacher, a middle-aged man named Professor Hernandez, whom he had seen patiently interacting with children during recess. He waited until classes ended and timidly approached the educator while he was organizing papers at his desk. "Excuse me, Professor," Mateo began in a hesitant voice. "I need help with something very important." Professor Hernandez looked at him with curiosity, immediately noticing his dirty clothes and his appearance of having lived outdoors. "Are you from around here, boy? I haven't seen you before." Mateo had carefully prepared his story, omitting the most dangerous details, but trying to convey the urgency of his situation. "I'm an orphan, and I discovered something in the mountains that I think is very valuable, but there are bad men trying to steal it, and I don't know what to do." To his disappointment, Professor Hernandez did not react with the seriousness he had expected. Instead, he smiled condescendingly and crouched down to Mateo's level. "Son, I understand that life on the streets can make the imagination very active, but inventing stories about treasures is not going to solve your real problems. What you need is to return to your family or to the orphanage where you belong." Mateo realized that without concrete evidence, no adult was going to believe the incredible story he had to tell. Worse still, Professor Hernandez had begun asking questions about his identity and background, which could lead him back into Don Ramiro's hands. His second attempt was with Father Luis, the priest of the local church. He decided to give the church another chance, hoping this priest would be different from Father Miguel, whom he had known at the orphanage. He waited until after Sunday Mass and approached the priest as he greeted parishioners on the church steps. "Father Luis," Mateo began, "I need to confess something very important." The priest, an older man with white hair and kind eyes, invited him into the confessional. There, Mateo told him a more complete version of his story, including his escape from the orphanage and the discovery in the mine. Father Luis listened in silence for several minutes before responding. "My son, I understand that you have gone through terrible hardships, but what you are telling me sounds like an elaborate fantasy. Hidden treasures exist only in movies. But what discouraged Mateo the most was what came next. I think it would be best if I turned you over to the appropriate authorities so they can help you return to where you belong. I'm sure there are people worried about you. Once again, Mateo realized that an adult in a position of authority was more interested in returning him to the system than in truly listening to what he had to say. He left the church quickly before Father Luis could contact anyone. His third attempt was the riskiest of all. He had noticed that there was a small state police office in town, with only 2 officers patrolling the region. He knew it was dangerous to approach any police authority, but he hoped that maybe there would be at least one honest officer who could help him. The officer on duty that afternoon was Sergeant Rodriguez, a stocky man in his 40s with a thick mustache and a serious expression. When Mateo nervously entered the office, the sergeant immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What are you doing here alone, kid?" he asked in a harsh voice. "Do your parents know where you are?" This time, Mateo decided to be more direct. "I'm the boy who escaped from the San Vicente orphanage a week ago. There's a reward for me, but I discovered something very important, and I need protection." Sergeant Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His eyes lit up with an expression Mateo recognized instantly, the same greed he had seen in Don Ramiro's eyes. "Ah, yes, the runaway kid," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Don Ramiro has been asking about you. He says they miss you very much at the orphanage." Mateo realized he had made a terrible mistake. This officer clearly had some kind of relationship with Don Ramiro and now knew exactly where to find him. "I think it would be best if I call the orphanage right now so they can come get you," the sergeant continued, reaching for the phone on his desk. But Mateo was already running toward the door. He had learned to trust his survival instincts, and everything about Sergeant Rodriguez's attitude screamed danger. "Stop," the officer shouted, but Mateo was already out of the office, running through the streets of the town as if his life depended on it. That night, hidden in his new cave, Mateo faced the harshest reality of all. Not only was he alone in the world, he was alone with a secret that was too valuable and too dangerous to handle without help, but also too unbelievable for any adult to believe without evidence. Worse still, Sergeant Rodriguez now knew he was in the area and had probably already contacted Don Ramiro. The searches would intensify, and his time was running out fast. It was then that he realized he needed a completely different approach. Instead of trying to convince skeptical adults with unbelievable stories, he needed to find concrete evidence that would be impossible to ignore. He needed to find a way to document what he had discovered. And more importantly, he needed to find adults who had both the power and the integrity to confront a conspiracy that clearly extended far beyond what he had initially imagined. His childhood had ended abruptly the day he escaped from the orphanage, but now he understood that he would have to grow up even faster if he wanted to survive what was becoming a battle between innocence and corruption, between justice and greed. The revelation that Sergeant Rodriguez was connected to Don Ramiro completely changed Mateo's strategy. He realized that corruption was more widespread than he had imagined, and that he needed to find allies outside the local system. But first he needed evidence that no one could deny or ignore. That night, Mateo made the riskiest decision he had taken so far. He was going to return to the mine to obtain photographic proof of the treasure before the bounty hunters finished looting it. He had found a disposable camera among garbage near the town, and although it was old, it still had a few exposures left. The return to the mine was terrifying. He had to wait until the early hours of the morning, when he was sure the looters would not be working. Using the escape route he had discovered, he managed to access the underground chamber again, where his worst fears were confirmed. Approximately half of the gold had already been removed. With trembling hands, he took photographs of the remaining gold bars, the scattered documents, and especially the markings and symbols that identified the treasure as possible war loot. Each flash of the camera seemed deafening in the silence of the cave, and he finished as quickly as possible before escaping again through the secret tunnel. The next day, he took the camera to the only photography shop in Santa Maria de los Remedios, a small business run by an older woman named Dona Esperanza. The woman was curious, but professional, and did not ask too many questions when Mateo paid for the developing with the few pesos he had left. When he returned later that same day to pick up the photographs, Dona Esperanza looked at him with a strange expression. "Boy, where did you get these photos?" she asked. "They look very important." The images had turned out better than he expected. The gold, the documents, and the Nazi symbols on some of the bars were clearly visible. Mateo realized that he finally had tangible evidence, but he still needed to find the right person to show it to. The answer came unexpectedly. As he walked through the town square, he overheard two women talking about a reporter from Mexico City who had come to the region to investigate stories of corruption in rural orphanages. "They say she's very brave," one of the women commented. "She's not afraid of anyone, not even powerful politicians." Mateo felt a spark of hope. An independent reporter could be exactly what he needed. Someone with the experience to understand the importance of what he had discovered and the resources to do something about it. He spent the rest of the day asking discreet questions until he learned that the reporter, Claudia Morales, was staying at the only hotel in town and had been interviewing local families about problems in government institutions. That night, Mateo waited patiently in the hotel lobby until he saw a woman in her 30s arrive with a recorder and a professional camera. He approached her with his heart pounding. "Ms. Morales," he began in a trembling voice, "I need to show you something very important about corruption, something much bigger than what you're investigating." Claudia Morales looked at him with curiosity. She was a slender woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail and intelligent eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate everything she saw. "Are you the boy everyone's been talking about?" she asked. "The one who ran away from the orphanage?" Mateo nodded nervously. "But that's not the important part," he said. "I found something that can change a lot of things, not just for me, but for other children too." The reporter studied him for a moment before deciding to give him a chance. "All right," she said. "You have 5 minutes to convince me." Mateo showed her the photographs and told his story in a concise but complete way. He watched as Claudia's eyes gradually widened while she examined the images of the Nazi treasure. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, studying the photos more closely. "If these images are authentic, we're talking about a massive, historical discovery." For the first time in weeks, Mateo felt hopeful. He had finally found an adult who not only believed him, but also understood the magnitude of what he had discovered. But Claudia also understood the dangers. "Mateo, if what you're showing me is real, there are very dangerous people involved in this," she said. "This isn't just local corruption, it's large-scale organized crime." Over the following days, Claudia worked discreetly to verify Mateo's story. She used her contacts in Mexico City to investigate the symbols in the photographs and confirm that they did indeed correspond to Nazi gold that had been reported missing after the Second World War. Meanwhile, she set Mateo up in a hidden room at the hotel, keeping him concealed while she investigated. But soon they realized they were not alone in their search for the truth. One night, Claudia returned to the hotel with alarming news. "Mateo, we're in more danger than I thought," she said. "My contacts in the city are telling me that very powerful people are asking questions about reporters investigating in this area." They had underestimated the extent of the corruption network. Don Ramiro was not just the corrupt director of an orphanage. He was part of a larger organization that had been protecting the secret of the Nazi treasure for decades. "I think someone in the town told them I'm here," Claudia continued. "We have to move tonight." But it was already too late. As they hurriedly packed their things, they heard vehicles stopping outside the hotel and male voices giving quiet orders. Claudia quickly grabbed her recording equipment and Mateo's photographs. "There's an emergency staircase at the back," she whispered. "We have to leave now." As they escaped through the rear of the hotel, Mateo realized that his fight for justice had escalated to a level he had never imagined. He was no longer just an orphan boy trying to avoid being sent back to an abusive institution. He was now a key witness in what could be one of the most important historical discoveries in Mexico, and there were people willing to kill him to protect their secrets. But for the first time, he was not alone. He had an adult ally who understood both the value of what he had discovered and the dangers they faced. Together, they would have to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. The escape from the hotel marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of Mateo's adventure. Claudia had managed to contact her superiors in Mexico City before the escape, and now they had support from the capital. But they also knew that their enemies were more powerful and better organized than they had imagined. During the following days, they moved constantly. Using a network of contacts Claudia had developed over years of investigative journalism. They stayed with families of human rights activists, in safe houses provided by non-governmental organizations, and in shelters run by religious groups that worked to protect vulnerable children. It was in one of these shelters that Mateo met the person who would change the course of the entire situation. Attorney Ana Guerrero, a lawyer specializing in children's rights who had dedicated her career to fighting child exploitation and institutional corruption. Attorney Guerrero was a woman in her 40s, with prematurely graying hair and a fierce determination reflected in every word she spoke. When Claudia showed her the photographs of the treasure and explained Mateo's situation, her reaction was immediate and decisive. "This case is much bigger than just a stolen treasure," she declared after studying all the evidence. "We are talking about a child trafficking network that has been operating for years, using orphanages as fronts for criminal activities." The lawyer explained that she had been investigating the San Vicente orphanage for months after receiving anonymous complaints about missing children and abusive conditions. Mateo's case provided the evidence she had been seeking to build a solid legal case. "Mateo," Attorney Guerrero said, "what you discovered will not only give you a safe future, it will help save hundreds of other children who are in similar situations." However, building a legal case against such a powerful network required more evidence and additional testimonies. The attorney organized a carefully coordinated operation. While she worked on the legal aspects from Mexico City, Claudia would continue investigating the extent of the corruption network, and Mateo would be protected by a temporary foster family experienced in safeguarding minor witnesses. The Herrera family, who lived in a small town several hours away from Santa Maria de los Remedios, welcomed Mateo as if he were their own son. Don Carlos and Dona Maria had lost their only child in an accident years earlier and had devoted their lives to helping children in difficult situations. For the first time since his parents' death, Mateo experienced what it meant to live in a home filled with genuine love. The Herreras not only provided him with physical safety, but also began healing the emotional wounds he had accumulated over years of abandonment and abuse. "My son," Dona Maria would say as she taught him to help in the kitchen, "no matter what happened before, now you are part of our family, and families protect one another." While Mateo adjusted to his new, temporary life, Attorney Guerrero and Claudia Morales worked tirelessly to build the case. They managed to infiltrate a private investigator into Don Ramiro's network, who confirmed that the orphanage director was indeed involved in child trafficking and the laundering of money from the Nazi treasure. But the operation nearly collapsed when Don Ramiro realized he was under investigation. One night, they received an emergency call. The San Vicente orphanage had been suddenly evacuated due to structural problems, and all the children had been transferred to unknown locations. "They're moving the evidence," Attorney Guerrero explained during an urgent phone call. "If we don't act now, all potential witnesses will disappear." It was time for the final confrontation. The attorney had obtained a court order to search the orphanage and arrest Don Ramiro, but she needed Mateo to formally testify about everything he had witnessed. On the day of the operation, Mateo returned to the San Vicente orphanage for the first time, but now he did so accompanied by federal agents, lawyers, reporters, and a social worker specialized in childhood trauma. The building looked even more decayed than he remembered, but it no longer terrified him. He had powerful and honest adults protecting him. Don Ramiro was arrested while trying to destroy documents in his office. The look of shock on his face when he saw Mateo enter accompanied by federal authorities was a moment of triumph the boy would remember for the rest of his life. "This can't be," the former director shouted. "He's just a lying child. No one is going to believe him." But the evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the photographs of the Nazi treasure, investigators found financial records showing payments from criminal organizations, lists of children who had been transferred to suspicious destinations, and correspondence linking Don Ramiro to an international child trafficking network. Mateo's testimony before the judge was clear and brave. He was no longer the frightened child who had fled in the night. He was a young boy who had found his voice and was using it to protect other vulnerable children. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "I lived for 3 years in conditions no child should ever experience. But what angers me the most is knowing that there are other children who are still suffering, and that we can prevent it if we act now." The sentence was decisive. Don Ramiro and his accomplices were sentenced to long prison terms. The trafficking network was dismantled, and new oversight protocols were established for all orphanages in the region. But most importantly for Mateo, the Nazi treasure was officially recognized as an archaeological and historical discovery of national value, and he was declared the legitimate discoverer, with rights to significant compensation that would ensure him a prosperous future. Justice had prevailed, but Mateo knew that his true reward was not the gold he had found, but the family he had gained and the opportunity to build a life dedicated to protecting other children who, like him, needed someone to believe in them and fight for their well-being. 6 months after the trial, Mateo's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined when he was a frightened child running away from the San Vicente orphanage. The Herrera family had completed the legal process to officially adopt him, and for the first time in years, Mateo had a real family that loved him unconditionally. The financial compensation for the discovery of the Nazi treasure had been substantial, but under the wise guidance of Attorney Guerrero and his new adoptive parents, most of the money had been placed in a trust for his university education and to establish a foundation dedicated to improving the living conditions of orphaned children in Mexico. Fundación Esperanza Nueva was the name Mateo chose for the organization he created with the help of Attorney Guerrero. The foundation was dedicated to multiple objectives: reforming the country's orphanage system, providing education and opportunities to children in vulnerable situations, and creating a safe reporting system for children who experienced abuse or neglect. The building of the former San Vicente orphanage had been completely renovated and transformed into a model care center where children received not only adequate housing and food, but also psychological support, quality education, and preparation for adult life. Mateo visited the center regularly not only to supervise operations, but to speak directly with the children and assure them that they had a voice and that there were adults willing to listen to them. "When I was your age," he would tell them during his visits, "I thought no one believed me and that there was no hope for children like us. But I learned that there are always good people willing to help. You just have to have the courage to keep looking until you find them." His story captured national attention thanks to the reports of Claudia Morales, who won major awards for her investigation into the child trafficking network they had dismantled. But beyond media fame, Mateo's story inspired real legislative changes in child protection and led to similar investigations in other states across the country. Attorney Guerrero had become more than just his lawyer. She was a mentor and a second mother who guided him in his new life as an advocate for children's rights. Under her guidance, Mateo began developing leadership skills and a deep understanding of how the Mexican legal system worked. "Mateo," the attorney told him during one of their monthly meetings, "you have demonstrated extraordinary maturity and strength for someone your age. I believe you have the potential to become a very powerful voice for vulnerable children in our country." At school, Mateo proved to be an exceptional student. The difficult years in the orphanage had strengthened his determination and his appreciation for educational opportunities. His teachers noted not only his academic intelligence, but also his natural ability to lead and his sensitivity toward other students facing difficulties. His adoptive parents, Don Carlos and Dona Maria, constantly marveled at how Mateo had transformed not only his own life, but theirs as well. The house that had been empty after the death of their biological son was now filled with laughter, deep conversations, and the energy of a young person who had found a clear purpose in life. "My son," Dona Maria would say during family dinners, "when God sent you to us, He gave us the chance to be parents again. But He also taught us that families are not always formed by blood, but by love and choice." On a personal level, Mateo had begun the slow process of healing the emotional wounds of his traumatic childhood. With the help of a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, he learned to process his past experiences and transform his pain into a driving force for positive change. He also maintained contact with other children who had been rescued from the corrupt orphanage system. Several of them had been adopted by loving families. Others were receiving specialized education, and some of the older ones were working directly with Fundación Esperanza Nueva as counselors for children who had gone through similar experiences. As for the Nazi treasure he had discovered, it was handed over to the National Institute of Anthropology and History, where experts confirmed that it was one of the most significant collections of stolen art and gold ever found in Latin America. The discovery opened new lines of investigation into the immigration of Nazi war criminals to Mexico after the Second World War. Mateo decided to donate a significant portion of his financial compensation to create a museum and educational center about the dangers of extremism and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. The museum would be built near the site where the mine had been, transforming a place that once hid criminal secrets into a space dedicated to education and historical memory. His plans for the future were ambitious but clear. He wanted to study law to follow in Attorney Guerrero's footsteps, specializing in human rights and child protection. He also envisioned expanding Fundación Esperanza Nueva internationally, working with similar organizations in other Latin American countries. "I want to make sure that no child has to go through what I went through," he declared in a recent television interview. "But more than that, I want all children to know that they have value, that they deserve love and protection, and that there is always hope, even in the darkest moments." On quiet nights in his new home, while doing his homework at his own desk, in his own room, Mateo sometimes reflected on the incredible journey he had lived, from the frightened child who had fled into the darkness to the young activist, who now had a voice in important decisions about child protection policies. His transformation had been complete. But what he valued most was not fame or recognition, but the simple moments of family life. Dinners with Don Carlos and Dona Maria, conversations about his dreams and hopes, afternoons helping in the garden, and the absolute security of knowing he was loved and protected. His story had shown that even in the most desperate circumstances, a child with courage and determination could not only change his own destiny, but also positively impact the lives of hundreds of other children. He had learned that true wealth was not in the gold he had found, but in authentic human relationships, and in the purpose of serving others who were in situations similar to those he had faced. Mateo had gone from being a silent victim of the system to becoming a powerful voice for change. His legacy would not be only the treasure he had discovered, but the lives he had transformed and would continue to transform through his dedicated work to protect and empower the most vulnerable children in society. This story of Mateo and his extraordinary journey from abandonment to empowerment reminds us that every child has inherent value and unlimited potential, regardless of the circumstances of their birth or the hardships they face. The transformation of a vulnerable orphan child into a young leader who dedicates his life to protecting others demonstrates that with proper support, genuine love, and fair opportunities, any child can not only overcome adversity, but become a force for positive change in the world. YouTube description: When 11-year-old Mateo escaped from a corrupt orphanage in the mountains of Guadalajara, he was running for his life. Hunted by men who saw him as nothing more than merchandise, he found refuge in the most unlikely place, a tunnel carved deep into the rock, leading to an abandoned mine that held secrets far darker than he could have imagined. What began as a desperate search for safety became a journey that would change not only his destiny, but the fate of hundreds of vulnerable children across Mexico. Inside the mine, Mateo discovered something that had been hidden for decades, a treasure so valuable that powerful people were willing to kill to protect it. But the real treasure wasn't what he found in the darkness. It was the courage he discovered within himself, and the allies who believed in him when no one else would. This is the true story of an orphaned boy who refused to be silenced, who turned suffering into purpose, and who proved that even the smallest voice can expose the greatest injustices. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more powerful tales of survival, courage, and transformation.